First, thanks all of you for coming. I know this is a tough time of the year, end of the year, for COVID protocol, and, but I'm so glad that so many of you joining us. It's such a pleasure, to welcome to Princeton University, one of the premier, one of the most experienced policymakers and actually thinkers of development issues in Africa, Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki. So Dr. Mayaki is originally from Niger. He has been the CEO of African Union Development Agency, New Economic Partnership for Development for the past 13 years. And prior to this role, he was also, I'm happy to add, the Prime Minister of Niger. And he also worked
in another life.
In another life. But he's also an academic. He taught in Venezuela, in Niger, and also helped set up a school of governance in Senegal, and one of the coordinators of agricultural food policy in West Africa. So as you can see, we will be hearing in a moment, he has a very unique, positive, forward-looking perspective on African development, and we are so happy, so honored to have him around us. And so he'll be talking for about 45 minutes, and then we are going to take half an hour Q&A. So let's enjoy the opportunity, and please take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be here and to have this interaction. I would like to have it as more a conversation than a one-way kind of talk. How many of you know the African Union as an institution? Okay, so it makes my life easy. So I will first start by doing an historical contextualization, and then I will end by the title of a conference, which is Africa's Critical Choices, New Directions for an African Roadmap to Development. There are three key words here: choices, Pan-African roadmap, and development. And my historical contextualization will go back to certain issues that you know quite well, but I want to insist on them. And the first one is what I consider as the biggest obstacle to the development of a continent, which is its fragmentation in 55 countries. That fragmentation, which, as you all know, is the result of the Berlin Conference on the division of the continent, is anti-development. So fragmentation is anti-development. As long as Africa stays fragmented, development will hardly happen. And when the political liberation processes took place in the 50s, in the 60s, and in the case of Southern Africa in the 80s, it led most of the leaders of the liberation processes to have a kind of schizophrenic attitude. So let me explain why we had a schizophrenic attitude. because all of them we were fighting for liberation processes within national boundaries, at the same time were Pan-Africanists. So they were questioning the national boundaries, but at the same time, they were thinking about how to unite the continent. So why was it schizophrenic? Because they had to build internally states and configure these states in order to tackle the challenges of the development. But at the same time, they knew that staying within these national boundaries wouldn't solve their issues. So in terms of policy making, in terms of state construction, it was quite a difficult and complex task for them. It's important to have this in mind in order to understand why the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, did in 2000 transform into the African Union. The OAU, which was the Organization of African Unity, was fundamentally motivated by national liberation processes. It had evidently in mind the question of building a Pan-African, Pan-African systems, processes, policy making processes, etc. But its main objective was political liberation. And when most of the continent got at the end of the 2000, at the end of the 90s, to a global political liberation, the leaders sensed the necessity to move from political liberation to what they called economic liberation, which was equal to development. And the transformation of the OAU into the African Union was fundamentally motivated by this change of paradigm from political liberation to development. So now we have the AU, the African Union, which is not like the European Union, which is not a supranational organization. It is an intergovernmental organization. So the difference, as you know, between a supranational organization and an intergovernmental organization is that in the case of the European Union, when they take directives, these directives need to be implemented legally by all the member states of the European Union. In the case of the African Union, the directives, the policies, the decisions which are taken are not legally binding. So in the process that leads to their design, there needs to be a high level of consensus, consultation, etc. And this is why sometimes the African Union is criticized for its slowness, for its difficulty to implement, but it's due to the nature of the organization, which is an intergovernmental one. And hopefully, in the next 10, 15, 20 years, it will reach the level of a supranational organization. And we can see it happening in quite a progressive and constructive manner, because, as you know, we have what we call regional economic communities in the north, in the east, in the west, in the southern part of the continent. And these regional economic communities have already advanced in terms of having legally binding decisions. So once we connect all these regional economic communities to the functioning of the AU, then we will be able to move to the level of having an AU, which is a supranational organization. So, in what will be the positive consequences of moving to a supranational organization? Well, first of all, the strengthening of common positions. I will give just 3 examples. We know that, for example, in infrastructural development, whether it is transport, energy, etc., we need regional solutions because they are more effective than national solutions. Let me give an example. If we have a common electricity market on the continent, access to energy will be facilitated to the 60% of Africans who do not have access to energy. And some countries have a surplus of energy, like Angola has a surplus of energy. But Angola cannot sell its surplus of energy because there is no market which has been configured for that. So that's an example. If we move towards a single electricity market, that will allow a better access to energy. So it's not so much about how many power plants we build, or how many renewable energy or solar energy plants we build. It's also about having common position on infrastructural issues. And the same thing happens with trade. Now, as you know, the African Union has designed a continental free trade agreement, which has been approved by most of the member states. And this continental free trade agreement is being progressively implemented in order to increase the level of intra-Africa trade, which is roughly estimated around 12 to 13%. It is 12, 13% because it doesn't take into account all the informal trade which takes place in a transboundary manner. But still, we have a very low level of intra-Africa trade. And by implementing the Continental Free Trade Agreement, it will allow us to increase the level of intra-Africa trade, and it will constitute at regional level a learning curve in terms of manufacturing in order to be competitive. So this is also a common position which is allowed by the existence of the African Union. Another example, which is a recent one, when the pandemic happened some 2 years back, the common position that African countries took in order to reinforce their CDC in Addis, and in order to convene all the health ministers of the continent and create nationally focal points for the CDC, did help in responding to the pandemic in quite an effective way. And a lot of stories have been said about, it's and theories. It's the fact that Africa is a hot continent, the fact that, etc., etc. But in reality, much less has been said on the capacity that the African Union has provided on the basis of a common position in order to respond to the pandemic. And that's why, among other reasons, the level of the impact of a pandemic was low. So by fighting against fragmentation and by strengthening continental organizations and regional organizations, it allows us, even with difficulty, to construct common positions. And when these common positions are constructed, it is much more efficient than national solutions. And that's the main message that I would like to convey on this question regarding fragmentation. Now, as we move towards as we have moved towards the African Union, and we have learned how to better design common policies, we are facing quite important challenges. I will mention some of the critical transitions that we are going through as a continent. The first one is the demographic transition. As you know, Africa is one of the very last regions of the world not to have finalized its demographic transition. And we still have demographic growth rates which are varying between 3.8 and 4.2. By 2050, the continent will double its population. This demographic transformation which is happening in the history of demographics does not have an equivalent. So how do politically, economically, sociologically, in terms of public policies, how do we respond to that challenge, to that demographic challenge is a very complex question. We were discussing this morning about, for example, the number of jobs that need to be created in the next 20 years. And they are estimated to around 20 million jobs per year in the next 20 years. You do the math, it's 400 million jobs that need to be created. But the 400 million we are talking about, they are about guys who are already born and with us. So this challenge is an enormous challenge because the fact of being able to create 20 million jobs will imply thinking about what type of manufacturing and industrialization will we go through. How will we transform agriculture? Because still we will double our population, but in 2050, we'll have a huge bulk of our population in rural areas. So how will we transform our agricultural systems so that small-scale farmers can become micro, small, and medium entrepreneurs? So how, in terms of manufacturing, what priority will we give to TVET issues in terms of training? Or how will we, as Professor Leonard is mentioning, how will we develop academic entrepreneurship? How will we combine all these solutions? And one of the things that Professor Leonard repeats and what I like is, it's not really about the what, it's about the how. So this challenge, this demographic challenge, will be a critical issue that we'll need to face. I will list the challenges and then I'll come back to the way I see them interlinked. The second challenge that we'll have to face is all what has to do with natural resources governance. As you know, Africa is a net zero emitter of CO2 because we are a latecomer in industrialization. But as also you know, we are being affected by climate change quite importantly. So there is still that thinking that the proportion of arable land in the continent is very important, but there is a degradation of arable land because of the impact of climate change. So the management of natural resources will be a critical challenge that we will need to face. And we will not be able to face it there also nationally. It will have to be through regional strategies and continental strategies. We will fundamentally have to count on ourselves because, as you know, in the different COPs that have been taking place, there has been a lot of talk about a green fund, which was going to be replenished with $100 billion every year during X years. But the green fund doesn't have really much resources because the commitments which are made were not effectively implemented. So in this challenge, we will also need, as a continent, to have a common position regarding the preservation of our natural resources and the limitation of climate change. And at the same time, according to most of the conventions that are taken in this domain, at the same time, we are somehow requested to go through a green industrialization. Green industrialization hasn't happened in the history of industrialization. So institutional and technological innovations will become extremely important. And that's the third type of challenge that we'll face, of transformation, transitions that we'll face, which is about technology. In a domain which is quite complex, like telecommunications, we were able to really leapfrog. And 1,300,000,000 inhabitants, roughly 500 million SIM cards. Mobile money is much more dense in Kenya than in the United States. Mobile banking, etc. So in terms of technology, Africans have been able to grasp technological solutions quite quickly, not at the elite level, but at the societal level. But still, we need a lot more of technological innovations in all the domains that I have been referring to. So, and this is why science and technology, there also has a common positions which needs to be strengthened, as to be given a critical priority. But science and technology, which is owned throughout the system. If I take the example of agricultural transformation, if we evaluate and we do that, the number of small-scale farmers who would check their cell phones in order to know the price of products they are producing in the near market and make the different comparisons. So in order to see where they can sell their products, I mean, it's a huge advancement. Many of these small-scale farmers who use their cell phones in order to check the prices are illiterate. But their capacity to use it is there. So just imagine that you improve their technological knowledge, you really can produce a transformation of the rural economy, which can be quite efficient and quite quick. So technological innovations will be a transition that we will need to go through and to face. The other transition that we'll need to tackle is about human development and inequality. Our education systems have been progressing, they are changing. The literacy levels are increasing. But at the same time, these education systems need to be reformed in such a way that they can help reduce inequality. As you know, we are the most unequal region in the world. And I'm coming from South Africa. South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. So inequality, in terms of this human development challenge, we need to be tackled properly if we want to have sound governance systems and stability. Why is it linked to education? The main and the critical factor that can help reduce inequality is access to education. And fundamentally, and you know that too, access to education of girls. Once you resolve access of education to girls, you solve 1,000 problems. You solve problem of nutrition, you solve problems of land distribution, you solve problem of espacement of maternity. I mean, you solve problems of inequality. Access of education to girls is fundamental. And that's why many economists agree that the full liberation of the African woman will be the main factor to really trigger the development of the continent. In my country, Niger, I was saying this morning that 50% of girls who are 15 are married. It's a huge obstacle to education. It's a huge obstacle to development. You solve this and you reduce it from 50% to even 20%. It's a radical change of a whole societal system which happens, and you liberate energy. So this aspect of giving importance to education as a challenge will be fundamental. And as a matter of fact, it is one critical priority of the African Union, which has a charter, an education charter, and which pushes towards a certain level of investment in education. At least 15% of public resources should be invested in education. And these different transitions and transformations I'm referring to have been seized through an agenda, which we call the Agenda 2063, which is a vision of what we would want Africa to be in 2063. It was designed in 2013, so it had a span of 50 years, and that's why it was called Agenda 2063, what is the Africa we want in 2063? An Africa which would be about 2.4 billion inhabitants, which is a very important number when we compare to what the world's population will be by then. And in Africa, where 75% of the population will be under 25. So having a vision towards 2063, which helps to look at these different transitions, demographic, natural resources, technological and human development challenges, and combine them in terms of how to tackle them in a holistic manner, not in a siloed manner, is an important instrument for the African Union. So this Agenda 2063, which is not very well known, is implemented according to segments of 10 years, and it's regularly evaluated. And the agency which I lead, which is the African Union Development Agency, which, by the way, I should have presented at the beginning, but the African Union Development Agency has this task of evaluating the implementation of Agenda 2063 every 2 years, and we report back. It's not about blaming and shaming, but it's about saying, well, Angola is doing well in agriculture, but badly in education. Niger is doing well in X sector, but badly in energy, etc. So it gives policymakers at the high level a picture of how the continental strategies are moving, but also how their own individual countries are doing. And giving them that picture from what I see and from what we analyze at the level of the African Union is an incentive to do better, because it's a kind of benchmarking on the one hand. It's not blaming and shaming, but it's a benchmarking, and every country wants to do better than the other one, on the one hand, and on the second hand, it allows also to depict what are best practices that can be shared from Southern Africa to East Africa to West Africa. So the evaluation of this agenda, which looks at tackling these transformations, gives us data which can feed public policy design. Now, let me go now to public policy design and issues of governance. The median age of Africa's population is 19 years old. As I frequently say, you cannot manage, in terms of governance systems, countries where the median age is 19 as countries where the median age is 43. Europe is an aging continent. Governance systems of Europe, the principles of the governance systems are the same, but the types of governance systems cannot be the same. Because when you have a population where 75% is under 25, you are under the pressure as a public policy maker to deliver quickly. And delivering quickly is a huge challenge. You cannot, change access to electricity from less than 60% to less than 10% in 2-3 years. So how, in a society where the median age is 19, can you govern with stability? And the only way to govern with stability, when you have this proportion of a population which is so importantly young, is to think about co-producing policies. So it has an impact on the role of the state and the central government. We are used to have central governments dictating policies on the basis of what experts were thinking. Fine. But how do you bring this huge portion of a population which wants quick results to buy in the policies that you are designing if they are not part of a production of a policy? And this is one of the critical changes we'll have to face in terms of governance. It's about democracy, yes, but it's fundamentally about how you see the question of ownership of a policy that you are designing. So it implies not only bringing the youth to be also actors of a public policy design, but it also implies that locally, because development happens locally, it also implies decentralizing as much as you can. Let me give you an example. With UNDP, and UNDP more than us, but with UNDP, we did a study on Boko Haram and how Boko Haram in Nigeria, you know Boko Haram, which is a terrorist group in Boko Haram, how Boko Haram was recruiting in northern Nigeria and part of Chad. The median age of a Boko Haram fighter is 16 years old. His median daily income is $3. And he has a Kalashnikov. So he has $3 a day, he has a Kalashnikov. So he has a sense of power. And the question is, you can't solve that through only military strategies. Because the number of these 16 years olds will keep increasing. And by gaining $3, they sometimes gain $3 more than the one who is staying quiet and doesn't have a Kalashnikov. So this is a tiny, small example, but which reveals that it's important to review the way public policies are designed so that they are co-produced. Because when these youths are part of a production of a policy, they have a sense of what can happen in the medium and long term. And they are able to own that policy, and they are able also to be actors of the implementation of a policy. So governance-wise, what we realize more and more is that a society where the median age is 19 needs to seriously think where power is. You can have a governance system, but the power resides in the majority of these 75% who are under 25. So your governance system has to adapt to this situation, and they have to be actors of a production of a policy. And that's one point on which I insist a lot, the issue of co-production of policies. But the second condition which is important is the deconstruction of centralization so that locally autonomy does exist much more. When I refer to Africa in general, I need to be corrected because, as you know, there are different Africas. East Africa doesn't have the same characteristic as Southern Africa, as North Africa, as East Africa. But I'm trying to target the common issues to all the regions. But be mindful that there are differences in the region. Decentralization processes are higher in East Africa than they are, for example, in North Africa. And decentralization processes in Southern Africa have different characteristics than in Central Africa. Central Africa being the region which is the most centralized of all, and which might face stability issues in the years to come because of that high level of centralization. So co-production of policies and local autonomy, so that decisions at local level can be made and people can feel that locally they have a possibility to change their reality. Because if development is not local, it has a very important consequence. So I went through the issues of fragmentation. Integration was important? What were the critical transitions and transformations that we were going through? How governance has to be reflected differently given the power structure that we have in our societies, and what are the conditions that can help have stability in these governance systems. So I would like to end. How long have I talked? Huh?
You can take questions for like 10 minutes.
Huh?
10 more minutes.
10 more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. So the roadmap towards Pan-Africanism is even more important today because of the global uncertainty in which we are living. Geopolitically, as you know, hegemony is not working as before. Power relationships globally are changing quite intensely. Towards what could be named or not, but you know that better than me, a type of Cold War, which doesn't have its name. So in a context like this one, which has a high level of uncertainty, Africa has to be united more than ever. Otherwise, we have reminiscences. You say reminiscence in English? Yeah. We have, memories of a Cold War. That was not a nice era for us because it didn't coincide with any type of development. So, in a context of global uncertainty, we need to be clear about our priorities. If we are not clear about our priorities, we might be relegated to a situation that we lived and that didn't allow us to grow. Before the pandemic, even if growth was not inclusive enough, Africa was growing economically. We had good economic growth rates. It's true that our debt was high, but most of the debt generally was invested in productive investment, generally. There are quite a number of bad actors, but generally, in the last 25 years, before the pandemic, we did quite well in terms of growth, in terms of trying to reduce inequality, even if it is high, in terms of reducing our agricultural, our dependence from imports of food. Progress was present. Progress was present. And contrary to, many characterizations, but when you look into details, even in the World Bank and IMF reports globally on how Africa had done, progress was important. With bad actors is true, with conflicts is true, but always remember the fact that the number of Africans who live in areas where there are conflicts are less than 5% of the total population of a continent. So when conflict is highlighted, as I just make a parenthesis, just to say that we made important progresses. These progresses can only be consolidated if we still keep having common positions as Africans. And in the face of global uncertainty, we have clear priorities that we need to look at. The first one is our common free trade, continental free trade agreement. That will be absolutely fundamental. That's where we'll have a learning curve of competitiveness and where we'll be able to manufacture and have sound basis for manufacturing. Especially, I'm just giving one example of what has to do with pharmaceuticals. If you look at the long-term strategies of Pfizer, Sandoz, all the big pharmaceutical companies, the market they are aiming at is the market where the population will double between now and 2050. That's where we will be able to sell. So in that global uncertainty, we need to be clear about manufacturing our medicines, evidently in partnership with these companies, but we need to be clear on the fact that dependency is not the solution. And this is why, for example, we are constructing the African Medicine Agency, which will be the continental regulatory body, common position again. Common position, Continental Free Trade Agreement, Africa Medicine Agency, etc. And in energy, a common priority will also be to have a single electricity market. In transport, we need to have a common air transport market, a single air transport market. Where does Air France makes its highest benefit in the world? It's in Africa. Air France doesn't make its highest benefit in Latin America, in the US, or in Asia. They make it in Africa. So we have, why they make it in Africa? Because we have not been able, in that case, to have a common position on a single air transport market, but this is a priority that we need to have. So our priorities are clear, and we come back to the how. And the how is, on the one hand, to have policymakers who have sufficient knowledge of the challenges and who can frame solutions, but not alone, by co-producing these solutions with their populations, which the majority is young and has a median age of 19. So let me stop here and then listen to the questions, if there are. Yeah, excellent. And thank you. Thank you.
Sorry.
Okay,
So thanks so much for such a wonderful.
You should speak into that microphone.
Oh yes.
Okay.
Here.
Okay.
Here. Okay.
The one on the right.
Either. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. So yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Mayaki, for such a powerful lecture. It has analytics. It's forward-looking, positive, and also very innovative. You know, I very much like, for instance, the link between the youthful population and co-production of policy. You know, it's something that, you know, I never heard before. I actually not thought about, but now I realize how critical it is for democracy in Africa to be participative, to be inclusive, and to be decentralized. You know, so for those of us here in economics, in political science, and sociology, I think there is quite a bit to take from this really, really interesting and powerful lecture. So we have time for about 20 minutes, I think, for Q&A. So please raise your hands and your name, your affiliation, and then you ask your question, please.
We actually have microphones here and here.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
There are microphones
okay,
on either side of the room.
I can hear you.
Yeah, please. Okay, you can come up. Exactly. So who else? So that we don't. Yeah, second. Okay, good. All right, go ahead. Thank you too much.
Okay, no, merci.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Professor Dr. Mayaki. Thank you for this lecture. My name is Gilles. I am from Haiti. I am a freshman looking to major in sociology, and I'm also representing the African Student Association, PASA. And during your presentation, you mentioned clearly that decentralization is very important for the development of Africa, and that it is also important to look at solutions that work for Africa rather than thinking of development in general terms. And one of the questions that I had was, if we are thinking about bringing solutions that work for the continent, how do we make sure that those solutions, or like this vision that we have for the continent, is not trying to, how do we implement this vision without compromising the cultural integrity of the continent? How do we do that without compromising the sociocultural identities present in the continent? That being said, like, how is it not simply taking what we've seen happen in other countries in the West or in other continents and implementing them, but being mindful of socioculturally what needs to be done for the continent so that its social cultural identity can be preserved? Thank you.
Okay.
So we maybe one more, and then yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Mayaki. It was a very informative talk. Thank you for being here. My name is Mohammed. I'm a senior studying French and economics. My question is, you mentioned when you were laying out sort of the historical background, saying that the African Union is currently an international organization, and that this was one of the reasons for its slowness. And you predicted that within a span of 15 to 20 years, you expected it to become a supranational organization. And my question is simply, what are some of the obstacles that make that time span 15 to 20 years and not 5 or 10 years?
Okay. Very,
So you
very,
can take those two questions,
yeah,
and then more.
yeah, very, very good questions. Let me reformulate the first question so you will tell me if I have understood. The question is, are the solutions which are going to be launched, implemented, are these solutions, can these solutions compromise integrity and cultural identity? You mentioned the terms cultural identity. Okay, so let me go far away from Africa and go to Japan and the Meiji period in Japan. When, after the fighting between the shogunates and, the stability of Japan led to a Meiji revolution. One of the critical aspects of a Meiji revolution was to send Japanese all over the world in order to look at the solutions that were allowing industrialization, education, etc. So when they came back, the idea was not to do mimetism, only mimetism, yeah. The idea was not to do mimetism. The idea was how to take a solution that they were seeing was working, for example, in manufacturing, and adapt it to the cultural identity of Japan. And that's why a country with degraded land, no no iron, no natural, density of natural resources very few. Put an accent fundamentally on knowledge. So it was not importing solutions in order to do mimetism. It was importing solutions in order to see how culturally these solutions could help develop, quote unquote, Japan. And an interesting thing about Japan is also that issue of co-production, because, let's not get into that. But what I think is that the current youth in the continent are, in my view, sufficiently linked to the continent. And as a matter of fact, when we look at the stats, the number of young Africans who graduate outside do come back. Even if they have spent 20 years, they do come back, or 15 years, they come back. They come back to build their own startups. They come back and they help change the systems in which they are. So there is no disconnection with the continent. I think there was more disconnection with those of my generation who tended to stay and not come back. But the youth of today, generally they come back because they sense, first of all, they have a high level of confidence in themselves. Two, they have accumulated knowledge. Three, they don't have any type of complex of inferiority, and they know that they can change the system when they come back, amidst all the difficulties that exist. So, if you ask my point of view, it might be subjective, but statistically they come back. They are actors of change. And being actors of change, they do link with networks internally, nationally, regionally, etc. And second point, what I also see, which we were not seeing, 20, 30 years ago, is young Nigerians going to Kenya to create an enterprise. Young Malians going to Angola. So there is, at the level of the youth, there is an important exchange. So they, more and more, they consider themselves as Africans and not Malians, Malawians, and etc., and they move in the continent. And that is a dimension that is a critical condition, for what you were mentioning. Will the cultural identity, maybe even Nigerians will change the cultural identity of the Kenyans, but it's okay. But the movements are really important. So I'm not so much worried about that. This is also a very good question. The European Union is a supranational because in their statutes, and they have decided that once they take a decision, it is legally binding. And whether it is on phytosanitary measures, whether it is on regulation of pharmaceuticals. If a decision is taken by Brussels, it has to be implemented by Portugal, Estonia, etc. And if it is not implemented, well, the Commission analyzes the gap of implementation and takes measures that can be sanctions. Okay. In the case of the African Union, we have not reached that point. And now let me go back to history. In the beginning of the OAU, there were two blocks and two schools of thought. One school of thought was saying, let's move quickly towards unifying the continent and having a strong unity which would have a legal dimension. Another school of thought was saying, no, let's go towards integration in a progressive manner. And the second school of thought won. So this is why we have what we call an intergovernmental organization. So we take decisions, but the decisions are not legally binding. If there is a decision on let's say, pharmaceutical regulation, Morocco can implement it, and South Africa can say, well, our parliament has decided that it doesn't suit us. So this is why I was saying the limitations of an intergovernmental organization can be tackled only through a lengthy decision process in order to reach the maximum consensus. So then you have a buy-in from the parties and the member states in order to implement. But evidently, the intergovernmental dimension has the limitation that I am mentioning, and we need to move towards a supranational organization like the EU, but we are not following the same path. The path that we are following is to take domains and sectors, and in these domains and sectors, reach a common position which can become binding. Like I was talking about the single electricity market. So how do we go about it? We have regional power pools. The idea is to convince every regional power pools to interconnect. And once we connect all the regional power pools, then we can move to an electricity market. So it's lengthier, but it's a progressive manner towards reaching a supranational organization. So I was saying it would take 10 or 15 years. So one critical aspect will be the type of leaders that will emerge in the continent. I frequently say, in the next 10 years, mathematically, 90% of the current heads of states that you know in the continent will no longer be there for X reasons. So a new set of leaders will emerge. Most probably, given the composition of our population, these leaders will be young. They will not be old as me. They will be young. And these young leaders, if you look at their political programs all over the continent, it has always a Pan-African dimension. So that's the hope that we have. But as a critical mass of young leaders with Pan-African ideas, we can make the AU move to a supranational organization.
Fantastic. So we have a couple of additional questions. Please. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, Dr. Mayaki. Thank you for the lecture. It was very holistic in terms of thinking about the challenges and how to proceed as a continent. My name is Damilola Akinyele. I'm Nigerian. I am the Executive Director of Princeton in Africa. I'll read out my question. It's a two-part question. You alluded to this earlier when you talked about Africa's response to COVID-19 and the role that the African Union played in bringing our leaders together for a common position. We've seen the rapid growth and development and collaboration within the younger population, as you also alluded to. But for some of these challenges that you mentioned that the continent is facing, especially in human development and the management of our resources that require more high-level government action, how have you seen the leaders in countries respond to this challenge? Either in adopting some of the policy suggestions made at the central level and then decentralizing it for our countries. I guess my second question is also, as the AU starts to move away from an intergovernmental organization within the next 20 years, what type of role would the organization play in security, political leadership, economic support for member countries? What do you envision that this leadership would be? And final question, so many questions. Thank you for such a wonderful lecture. How does the AU plan to build more accessibility to this Agenda 2063 that you talked about? For leaders on the local level, separate from the heads of state. So you talked about emerging leaders, but then there's also governors, the House of Representatives, and local government chairmen who make these decisions that affect the day-to-day of people in their countries. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Agenda 2063 is somehow a type of co-production because it was elaborated in a bottom-up process. It was not a governmental affair, it was also civil society actors, private sector, etc. So the fact that it was a bottom-up process made it better known internally than other programs like the SDGs. The SDGs are not as well known. Well, the SDGs are a UN instrument, but they are not as well known as Agenda 2063. And the fact that there is a regular evaluation of its implementation, it brings accountability. So if you go on our website, NEPAD, AUDA-NEPAD.org, you will see the evaluation of Agenda 2063. And you can look at your country and see how well the country does in nutrition, agricultural productivity, renewable energy, etc. We produce a report every 2 years. So it was a bottom-up process. On the issue of response to the COVID-19, the capacity to respond gave confidence to Africans in being sure that common positions, well coordinated, could work, you see. And the current CDC has focal points in all the 50 plus countries. They could collect information quickly and respond with adapted solutions also nationally. And that did help in facing the pandemic. And it also helped in thinking about innovative solutions regarding, for example, the masks. Because we didn't have a mask when the pandemic occurred. So we are relying on donations of masks left and right. But if you see the quantity of startups which started producing masks, it was quite impressive with an ecosystem which was also created by the CDC. So one fundamental issue that I want to raise is that today Africans have globally, within the AU and globally, much more confidence in themselves in moving forward. During quite a long time, we were somehow considering ourselves as the last of the class, But this is no longer in the mindset. And that brings me back to the issue of cultural identity and issues of integrity. Today, the confidence is there. So we know that we can construct the solutions, and we come back to the issue of the how. But we are not looking for solutions that someone would invent for us. We are trying to see how the solutions that we can construct can be implemented. So if it is a fundamental change, it's a change in terms of having confidence in ourselves. 2, in 2100, 1 of 4 inhabitants of this planet will be African. So I think the world also needs to take that into account, because the more progresses we make, the better it is for the world globally. So, because the question is not to be against the world, the question is to best be part of the world, you see, and contribute. FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, is saying that, between now and 30 years, given the population growth, the world will have, I'm quoting, will have to produce the same amount of food that it has produced in the last 3,000 years, 3,000. So when you look, where is arable land available? Even if it's get degraded, it's on the African continent. So the African continent can feed really can help tackle this gap of food with the sound agricultural transformations, and it's in the interest of the whole world. So this is why amidst the global uncertainties, it's important to have our common positions and to build on that confidence in order to tackle our challenges. I don't know if I responded to all of them, but okay.
So you'll be hard pressed to listen to a lecture that's more insightful, positive, and also more realistic, about Africa. So, there is a recent paper showing that, in fact, not only African GDP have doubled the past 20 years, that institutions in Africa are looking more like the institutions around the world. So then the question for us is, how do we improve? How do we make those institutions more effective by taking into consideration our culture, our identity, and also mobilize these skills assets that we have, which is the youth, their confidence, their energy. So it's very uplifting, and I would like every one of us to stand up and to
No, please. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.